She shouldn't have been there at all, but she was standing in front of Evelyn Harrington's grave waiting for the man who had not visited in months, as if time itself had brought her there for a reason she already understood, but he had yet to discover. The cemetery was quiet in that heavy morning way, where even the wind seemed careful not to disturb the dead, and rain had fallen earlier, leaving the stone paths dark and reflective like polished glass under a gray sky that refused to brighten. William Harrington stepped through the iron gates alone, his coat perfectly tailored but slightly damp at the shoulders, his expression controlled in the way powerful men learn to wear grief like a mask that never quite fits, and every step he took toward his wife's resting place carried the weight of unfinished conversations, memories he had postponed, and silence he could no longer justify. He had not expected anyone to be there, least of all a child, but as he approached the familiar row of white marble headstones, he saw her clearly, a small black girl standing straight and still beside Evelyn's grave, her hands folded as if she belonged in that moment more than he did, and something about that sight made him slow his steps without knowing why. The girl was young, no older than 7, wearing a simple coat that looked too large for her frame, her hair neatly braided, her eyes fixed on the inscription of Evelyn Harrington as though she had read it many times before and was waiting for it to respond. William stopped several feet away, his voice measured but sharp with caution as he asked who she was and why she was there, but the girl did not flinch or step back. Instead, she turned her head slightly as if she had been expecting him specifically, and said quietly, "Are you Mr. Harrington?" And hearing his name spoken in that place by someone who should not have known it sent an unexpected chill through him. He glanced around instinctively, half expecting someone to appear, a caretaker, a relative, anyone who could explain this intrusion into a moment that was supposed to belong only to memory and regret. But there was no one, only the distant rustle of trees and the soft sound of water dripping from stone. William asked again, more firmly this time, how she knew his wife's name, and the girl looked down at the grave for a long moment before answering. "She told me I would find you here when you finally came back," and the words landed in the air between them like something too heavy to ignore, too precise to dismiss. For a brief moment William felt the absurdity of it, the idea that his late wife could have spoken to this child. But grief has a way of opening doors in the mind that logic struggles to close, and instead of walking away, he found himself staring at her more closely, noticing the way she held something small in her hand, something she seemed reluctant to reveal. The girl finally stepped forward and placed a folded piece of cloth gently against the edge of the headstone, then looked up at him with a calmness that did not match her age and said, "She said you would recognize this too." And when William's eyes dropped to the object, his breath tightened slightly, because it was a ring, old and slightly worn, the kind of ring he had once seen on his wife's hand in photographs he had stopped looking at after her passing. He reached out instinctively but stopped himself just short of touching it, as if proximity alone might confirm something he was not prepared to accept, and his voice lowered as he asked where she had gotten it. The girl did not answer immediately. Instead, she seemed to be listening to something only she could hear, and when she spoke again, her words carried a weight that did not belong in a child's voice. "She said you would try to forget, but you never could." And at that moment, William felt something inside him shift, not violently, but deeply, like a locked room in his memory had been opened without permission. He stepped back slightly, trying to regain control of his thoughts, telling himself there had to be an explanation, that someone must have sent her, that this was some misunderstanding. Yet the precision of the moment, the location, the ring, his wife's name spoken without hesitation, all of it pressed against his certainty like cracks forming in glass under steady pressure. The girl remained still, waiting, not asking for anything, not pleading, simply existing in that space between truth and disbelief. And for the first time since he arrived, William realized that this was not a coincidence he could easily walk away from. The wind shifted gently through the cemetery, brushing against the trees and carrying with it a silence that felt heavier than before. And as William looked from the ring back to the child standing at his wife's grave, he understood that whatever came next would not allow him to remain the same man who had walked in only minutes earlier. William Harrington stood motionless in front of the grave as the words from the child lingered in the cold air, settling into places inside him that he had spent years carefully locking away. The ring in her small hand caught a faint glint of gray light as she held it steady, not offering it forward anymore, but not hiding it either, as if she understood that its presence alone was enough to change everything that came next. He finally forced himself to speak again, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp control he had used moments before, asking her where she had gotten it. And for the first time the girl shifted her gaze away from the stone and looked directly at him, as if measuring whether he was ready to hear the answer. She said her name was Grace Williams, and that she had been staying at a shelter on the edge of the city for as long as she could remember, but the ring had not come from there. It had come from a woman who used to visit quietly, without anyone noticing, a woman who always sat near the back and never stayed long. William felt his chest tighten at the mention, though he did not yet allow himself to believe what his mind was starting to piece together. Grace continued, saying that the woman had spoken gently, never saying her full name at first, only sitting beside her and asking questions no one else bothered to ask, like what she dreamed about and whether she felt safe at night. And over time she had started to come more often, bringing small things like food or blankets, always leaving before anyone could thank her. William's throat went dry as he listened, because the picture forming in his mind did not match the story he had told himself about his wife's final months, the version where she had been confined to medical care and silence. He shook his head slightly, almost as if rejecting the direction of the memory, and asked the girl carefully how she could possibly know it was his wife, and Grace hesitated for the first time, glancing down at the ring as if it was giving her permission to continue. She said the woman had shown her a photograph once, a faded image of a man standing beside a lake, laughing in a way Grace had never seen William laugh in the few news articles she had once found, and the woman had told her that the man in the picture was someone who had forgotten how to listen. William felt a sudden discomfort at the accuracy of the phrase, because it was not something a stranger should have known, not something easily guessed or repeated by chance. He took a step closer, the gravel beneath his shoes shifting softly, and asked why she was here now, today, at this exact place. And Grace's voice softened as she said the woman had told her that if anything ever happened, she should bring the ring back to him, because he would need it more than she ever would. The wind moved again across the cemetery, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled only with the sound of leaves brushing stone. William finally asked the question he had been avoiding since the beginning, who the woman was, and Grace looked at the headstone once more before answering simply, Evelyn, as if there was no other name she could have meant. The world around William seemed to narrow at that moment, the trees, the sky, even the distant road fading into something distant and unimportant, because hearing his wife's name spoken like that, not in memory, but in present connection to this child, forced something open inside him he had not prepared for. He told himself again that there had to be an explanation, that grief and imagination often built connections where none existed, yet the ring now felt heavier in the space between them, as if it carried more than metal and time. Grace finally extended it toward him, not insisting, only waiting, and when William did not immediately take it, she placed it gently on the top of the stone between them, as if returning something that had always belonged there. He looked at it for a long moment, then at her, noticing for the first time that she was watching him not with expectation but with quiet certainty, as though the real question was not whether the story was true, but whether he was ready to remember it. And in that silence, standing beside the grave of the woman he thought he had known completely, William Harrington realized that whatever truth this child carried, it was already too close to turn away from. The name Evelyn lingered in William Harrington's mind like an echo that refused to fade, repeating itself with a quiet persistence that made the world around him feel slightly out of place, as if the cemetery, the sky, and even the air itself had shifted into a version of reality he had not agreed to enter. He stood still, looking at the ring now resting against the cold stone of his wife's grave, and for the first time since arriving he was no longer focused on the child in front of him, but on everything he thought he had already understood about the woman buried beneath the marble. Grace Williams remained quiet beside him, her small hands folded again, her posture steady but patient, as if she had already delivered what she came to give and was simply waiting for him to decide what kind of truth he was willing to accept. William finally reached down and picked up the ring, holding it between his fingers carefully, almost cautiously, as though it might dissolve if handled too quickly. and as he turned it slightly in the weak light, he noticed details he had not seen at first, faint markings along the inside edge, initials worn down by time and touch. His breath slowed, not from calmness but from recognition trying to surface against his resistance, because those initials were not unfamiliar to him. They belonged to a time before hospitals, before silence, before distance had replaced understanding in his marriage. He looked at Grace again, his voice lower now, asking her to tell him everything exactly as she remembered, not missing anything, not changing a detail, and the girl nodded once before beginning again. She said the woman had not only visited the shelter but had stayed longer than anyone realized, sometimes arriving early in the morning before the staff fully opened, sometimes sitting with children who had no one else waiting for them, and always asking for Grace specifically, as if she had been looking for her all along rather than finding her by chance. William frowned slightly at that detail, because no record he knew of placed Evelyn anywhere near that part of the city, yet the certainty in the child's voice made it difficult to dismiss. Grace continued, explaining that Evelyn had never spoken about illness or fear, only about time and choices, and how sometimes people forget that their lives are shaped not only by what they build, but by what they choose to ignore. William felt a subtle tightening in his chest at those words, because they were not abstract or poetic, they felt directed, intentional, as if they had been meant for him long before this moment. He asked Grace when all of this had happened, and she hesitated before saying it was during the months when the weather began to turn cold, when the city felt emptier at night, and the shelter lights stayed on longer than usual. William did not respond immediately, his thoughts shifting through timelines, trying to place his wife in the fragments of memory he had of that period, remembering appointments she had declined, evenings she had spent alone, explanations he had accepted without question because he had been too absorbed in work to look deeper. The realization forming was not sudden, but it carried weight with each second it grew clearer, because it suggested that Evelyn had been living a part of her life that he had never truly seen. Grace watched him carefully, not interrupting, and then added softly that Evelyn had once said William would not understand everything at once, but that understanding would come when he stopped trying to look only at what was in front of him and instead began to notice what had been quietly growing around him. The phrase struck him harder than he expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it mirrored something he had heard his wife say before, years earlier, in a conversation he had dismissed at the time as sentimental rather than meaningful. He turned slightly away from the grave, looking out across the rows of stone markers as if distance might help organize his thoughts, but instead everything felt closer, as though the past was no longer separated from the present in the way he had always believed it to be. Behind him, Grace spoke again, this time more quietly, saying that Evelyn had asked her to come here only if she ever felt it was the right time, and that she should not come to ask for anything, but only to return what had been given with trust. William slowly turned back toward her, studying her face more carefully now, noticing not just her calmness but the absence of expectation in her expression, as if she had already fulfilled her part in something much larger than this moment. The wind moved gently through the cemetery again, lifting the edges of William's coat as he stood between the grave and the child, the ring still held in his hand, and for the first time, he began to consider that what he was holding was not simply an object from the past, but a connection between two lives he had never realized were intertwined. And in that growing silence, with no one else around to confirm or deny what was unfolding, William Harrington understood that the answers he had spent years avoiding might no longer be something he could choose to postpone. William Harrington stood with the ring still resting in his palm, feeling its weight in a way that no physical object should have been able to create, as if it carried not only memory but intention. And as he remained silent beside the grave, the distant sound of footsteps on gravel slowly broke the fragile stillness around him. He turned slightly and saw a man approaching from the cemetery path, dressed in a dark coat and carrying a leather folder, his pace careful but purposeful, the kind of presence that belonged to conversations involving documents, permissions, and explanations rather than emotion. The man stopped a few steps away and nodded respectfully, addressing William as Mr. Harrington, and introduced himself as Mark Donovan, the legal advisor who had handled parts of Evelyn Harrington's affairs. William's expression tightened slightly at the unexpected arrival, and he asked what he was doing there, because no meeting or arrangement had been scheduled. Yet Mark's eyes shifted briefly toward the grave and then toward Grace, as if confirming something he already feared would not remain hidden. Grace did not move closer or step back. She simply observed, her small figure unchanged against the large stone, while Mark opened his folder with controlled precision and said he had been instructed to ensure that certain personal matters connected to Evelyn were delivered under specific conditions if they were ever triggered. William frowned, asking what conditions he was referring to, and Mark hesitated for the first time, choosing his words carefully as he explained that Evelyn had made arrangements during the final months of her life that extended beyond medical records or inheritance documents, arrangements that involved private visits, recorded instructions, and one item in particular that had been kept outside of formal legal channels. William felt a slow tightening in his chest as he listened, his gaze shifting from the lawyer to Grace, then back again, as the realization that his wife had created a parallel path of communication without him began to settle in. He asked sharply why none of this had been disclosed earlier, and Mark lowered his voice, saying that Evelyn had specifically requested timing, and that the information was not to be released until the moment someone arrived with the ring in question. William looked down at his hand again, the metal now feeling less like a memory and more like a key that had opened something he was not prepared to enter. Grace finally spoke again, quietly but clearly, saying that Evelyn had told her not to be afraid if more people came, because not everyone would understand immediately, and that the truth would feel uncomfortable before it felt real. Mark turned slightly toward the child, studying her with a mixture of uncertainty and recognition, then confirmed that she matched the description. Evelyn had left, though he did not elaborate further, as if even speaking too much might distort what had been carefully preserved. William stepped closer to him, demanding to know exactly what Evelyn had been doing, because the image forming in his mind no longer aligned with the version of events he had accepted for months. And Mark finally admitted that Evelyn had been spending time at shelters under a different name, offering support to children without drawing attention to herself, and that her visits had been deliberately kept unrecorded at her request. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant movement of wind across stone, and William turned away slightly, as if needing space to process what he was hearing, but Grace's voice pulled him back gently when she said the woman had never spoken of him with anger, only with quiet reflection, as if she had been observing something he had not yet learned to see. William asked her what Evelyn had said about him, and Grace hesitated, then replied that she said he was someone who believed in fixing things that could be measured, but struggled with things that could only be felt. The words struck him in a way that no legal document or financial report ever had, because they did not accuse him. They simply described him with unsettling accuracy. Mark closed his folder slowly, saying there was one final instruction, that the ring was meant not as an explanation but as an invitation, and that Evelyn had wanted William to decide what to do next without being told what to believe. William looked at the ring again, then at Grace, noticing for the first time that she was not asking for recognition or reward, only standing as if fulfilling a message that had already been delivered. The cemetery around them remained unchanged, but something within the moment had shifted permanently, and William understood that whatever Evelyn had set in motion did not end with the objects he held, but with the choice he now had to make about what kind of truth he was willing to live with. The silence in the cemetery lingered long after the lawyer's words faded, leaving William Harrington standing between what he had known and what he could no longer deny, the ring still resting in his hand like a question that refused to be answered quickly. Grace Williams remained near the grave, her small figure steady against the cold stone, while Mark Donovan had stepped back slightly, as if giving space for a decision that could not be guided by paperwork or explanation. William finally lowered his gaze to the ring again, turning it slowly between his fingers, and for the first time since arriving, he felt something shift that was not confusion but direction, as if every unanswered detail had begun forming a path forward instead of a wall. He exhaled slowly and asked Mark where Evelyn had gone during those months when she was not where he believed she had been, and Mark hesitated before answering that she had divided her time carefully, never remaining in one place long enough to be traced, always choosing locations where her presence would not interfere with how others defined her. William asked if there were records, and Mark confirmed there were only partial notes, deliberately fragmented at Evelyn's instruction, but enough to indicate a pattern of visits to places that supported children in transition, children without stable homes or consistent guardianship. The words settled heavily between them, and William looked toward Grace again, realizing she was not an exception to something random, but part of a path that had been deliberately chosen by someone he thought he had fully known. Grace shifted slightly for the first time, not in discomfort, but in a quiet readiness, as if sensing that what came next would determine whether she stayed a messenger or became something more permanent in this unfolding truth. William asked her gently why she had stayed when she could have simply left the ring somewhere and walked away, and Grace looked down at her hands before answering that Evelyn had told her not to be afraid of people who take time to understand, because the ones who truly listen do not always respond quickly. The simplicity of that statement struck William more deeply than any legal revelation, because it revealed a side of Evelyn that he had not participated in, a version of her that had moved through the world with patience instead of expectation. Mark closed his folder again and added that there was one more instruction Evelyn had left, not written in any formal document, but recorded in a private message intended only for the moment when the ring was returned directly to William. William asked for it immediately, and Mark reached into the folder carefully, producing a small sealed envelope that had clearly been handled with restraint and time. He handed it over without ceremony, and William took it slowly, noticing the faint handwriting on the front, his wife's name followed by a single instruction to be opened only here. The cemetery felt even quieter as he broke the seal, unfolding the paper with a steadiness that did not match the tension in his chest, and as his eyes moved across the lines, his expression shifted from control to something closer to recognition mixed with regret. The message did not explain everything, nor did it attempt to justify what had been hidden. Instead, it spoke directly to him in a tone he had not heard in years, describing not events but distance, not actions but absence, and how sometimes love does not disappear but becomes invisible when it is no longer witnessed. William lowered the letter slightly, his hand tightening around it as he processed the realization that the life he thought had ended in silence had actually continued in ways he never observed. Grace watched him carefully, not interrupting, and for the first time there was a subtle change in her expression, not of expectation but of understanding that something inside him was finally moving. William looked back at the grave, then at the ring, then at Grace, and asked quietly if Evelyn had ever said what she hoped he would do after receiving everything, and Mark answered that she had not given instructions for action, only for awareness, because she believed some truths were not meant to direct behavior but to restore perception. The wind passed through the trees again, but this time it felt less like distance and more like continuity, as if the space around them was no longer separating past and present, but allowing them to exist together. Without resistance, William stood there for a long moment, the letter still in his hand, the ring reflecting the muted light, and Grace waiting without urgency. And in that quiet intersection of memory and reality, he began to understand that leaving this place unchanged was no longer an option that would hold. William Harrington stood in the cemetery with the letter still trembling slightly in his hand, its edges softened by his grip, as if even the paper itself had begun to carry the weight of realization, and for a long moment he did not move, as though any decision might fracture the fragile understanding forming inside him. Grace Williams remained quietly near the grave, her presence no longer feeling like an interruption, but like a fixed point in a reality that had shifted too far to return to its original shape, while Mark Donovan waited a few steps away, respectful but attentive, as if prepared for whatever William might choose next. William finally folded the letter again with careful precision and placed it inside his coat, then looked down at the ring once more, noticing how ordinary it appeared now despite everything it represented, and he asked Mark in a steady voice where Evelyn had been going most often during those months, not in general terms, but specifically, as if the answer might lead him to the missing piece that had been deliberately left out of his understanding. Mark hesitated briefly, then said that the most consistent location recorded in Evelyn's private notes was a shelter on the west side of the city, a place that operated quietly without publicity, serving children and families who often moved through systems unnoticed. And he added that Evelyn had insisted on entering and leaving without recognition, so that her presence would not alter the environment she intended to understand rather than control. William absorbed the information slowly, his eyes lowering for a moment as if trying to map this new reality onto the version of his wife he had carried in memory. And when he looked up again, he turned toward Grace with a different kind of attention, seeing her not as an isolated figure at a gravesite, but as someone connected to a broader path he had not known existed. He asked Grace gently if she would come with him to the shelter Mark had mentioned, and the question surprised even him in its immediacy, as though the decision had formed before he consciously allowed it. Grace did not answer right away, her gaze shifting briefly to the grave, then back to him, and she asked softly if he was sure, because Evelyn had also said that some people needed time before stepping into truths that would not feel comfortable at first. William nodded once, more certain than he had been at any point since arriving, and said that time had already passed in ways he could no longer measure in the same way. Mark closed his folder and confirmed that he could provide the address and arrange transport if needed, but William declined the offer, saying he would go immediately, not because he had clarity, but because remaining still no longer felt possible. The three of them left the grave together, the movement slow and quiet along the cemetery path, with Grace walking slightly ahead without hesitation, as if she had already traveled this route in a different form before, and William followed behind her with the ring still in his hand, no longer questioning why she had been the one to bring it. As they reached the gate, Mark paused and told William that there was one final detail Evelyn had requested be understood rather than explained, that her actions were never meant to replace what was missing but to reveal what had been overlooked, and William acknowledged the words without responding further, because anything he might have said felt incomplete in comparison to what he was beginning to see. Outside the cemetery, the city appeared unchanged, but William experienced it differently now, as though every distance between places contained something previously invisible, and when a car arrived to take them toward the shelter, he allowed Grace to enter first before following her inside. During the drive, silence filled the space between them, not uncomfortable but dense with thought, and William occasionally glanced at Grace in the seat beside him, noticing how she watched the passing streets with quiet familiarity, as if she recognized not the buildings themselves, but the patterns of movement that connected them. He asked her softly if she was afraid, and she shook her head, saying she had already learned that fear did not change outcomes, only awareness did, a statement that lingered in his mind longer than he expected. When the vehicle finally slowed near the address Mark had provided, William saw a modest building ahead, unremarkable in structure, but carrying a sense of constant motion at its entrance, people coming and going without ceremony. And for a moment he hesitated before stepping out, realizing that crossing into this place meant accepting that Evelyn's life had extended far beyond the boundaries he had assumed. Grace stepped out first and looked back at him, not urging him forward, but simply waiting, and William followed, closing the distance between himself and the entrance as if each step required him to leave behind another version of certainty. The air outside felt different here, not heavier or lighter, but more immediate, and as he approached the door, he understood that whatever he would find inside was no longer about explanation alone, but about whether he was willing to see his wife's life not as something finished, but as something that had continued without his awareness. The entrance of the shelter opened with a soft mechanical sound that felt out of place compared to the heaviness William Harrington carried inside him, and as he stepped forward behind Grace Williams, the atmosphere immediately shifted from the quiet of the cemetery and the stillness of the drive into a living space filled with movement, distant voices, and the subtle rhythm of people trying to rebuild parts of their lives in small, careful steps. The air inside was warmer, carrying the faint scent of paper, fabric, and something like freshly brewed coffee, and William paused just long enough to take it in before continuing forward, his presence drawing brief but respectful glances from staff who recognized him without needing introduction. Grace moved ahead without hesitation, as if she had memorized the layout of the place not through maps, but through repetition of experience, and she led him through a hallway lined with bulletin boards, drawings, and handwritten notes, each one marking moments of care that were not meant for public attention. William's eyes moved across the walls as he walked, noticing photographs of group activities, donation lists, and small handwritten messages of gratitude, none of which carried any indication of the woman he had come here to understand, yet all of which created a growing sense that Evelyn Harrington had moved through this world in ways that had never intersected with the life he thought they had shared completely. At the end of the hallway, Grace stopped in front of a small office door and gently pushed it open without knocking, as if she already had permission that existed beyond formal rules, and William followed her inside to find a woman seated at a desk surrounded by files and soft lighting from a window that overlooked a small courtyard. The woman looked up immediately, her expression shifting from routine focus to careful recognition as she saw William Harrington standing there, and she introduced herself as Sarah Collins, the director of the shelter. William wasted no time with formalities, asking directly if Evelyn Harrington had been here, and Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding, confirming that Evelyn had indeed spent time within these walls, though never under circumstances that would have drawn attention from outside. William felt a subtle tightening in his chest at the confirmation, and Grace stepped closer to the desk, placing the ring carefully on its surface as Sarah's eyes lowered toward it with quiet understanding rather than surprise. Sarah explained that Evelyn had first arrived months earlier under a different name, choosing to observe rather than announce herself, and that she had gradually become involved in supporting children who had no consistent guardianship or stable environment, often sitting with them during meals or helping them with reading and writing in ways that felt more personal than institutional. William listened in silence, his expression controlled but increasingly strained as he processed each detail, because none of it aligned with the image of a woman confined to illness or absence as he had believed. Sarah then reached into a drawer and retrieved a small envelope, explaining that Evelyn had left instructions for it to be shown only if William ever arrived with the ring, and that it had been stored exactly as requested until this moment. William took the envelope slowly, recognizing the handwriting immediately, and for a moment he did not open it, as if delaying the contents might preserve the fragile distance between what he knew and what he was about to learn. Grace stood quietly beside him, watching without expectation, and Sarah gently excused herself, leaving them in a space that now felt suspended between memory and revelation. When William finally opened the envelope, he found not a long explanation but a single folded sheet and a small access card attached to it. And as his eyes scanned the page, he realized it was not addressed to him as an apology or justification, but as a continuation of something she had already begun elsewhere. The message spoke of observation rather than absence, of understanding people not through proximity, but through attention, and of how she had come to realize that some truths cannot be fully shared while still being lived within the same structure that shaped them. William lowered the paper slightly, his grip tightening around it as he tried to reconcile the simplicity of the words with the complexity of what they implied, and Grace quietly pointed toward the courtyard, saying that Evelyn had often sat there in the mornings, speaking with children who reminded her that not all connections require explanation to be real. William looked through the window and saw the courtyard for the first time, noticing how ordinary it appeared, and yet how deeply it seemed to hold traces of presence he had never witnessed. Sarah returned briefly, confirming that the access card granted entry to a restricted storage room where personal records and recorded messages had been placed according to Evelyn's instructions, and William realized that the next step was no longer about interpretation but about witnessing what had been intentionally preserved. As he held the card in his hand, standing between Grace and the doorway that led deeper into the shelter, William Harrington understood that the truth he had been approaching was no longer distant or abstract, but something waiting just beyond a door that he could no longer avoid opening. William Harrington stood for a long moment in front of the office door holding the access card that Sarah Collins had handed him, feeling its smooth surface between his fingers as if it carried not just authorization but a threshold between what he had known and what he was no longer able to avoid. Grace Williams remained beside him, her small presence steady and quiet, watching without pressure or urgency, while the shelter behind them continued its subtle movement of voices and footsteps, life continuing in a rhythm that did not pause for personal revelation. William finally exhaled and stepped forward, sliding the card into the reader, and as the lock released with a soft click, he felt an unfamiliar stillness settle inside him, not calm, but anticipation mixed with uncertainty. The door opened into a narrow room dimly lit by soft overhead lighting, filled with labeled storage boxes, folders, and a small table positioned in the center, as if it had been prepared for exactly this moment. And William entered slowly, his eyes scanning the space as though expecting something to speak before he did. Grace followed him in and remained near the entrance, not interfering, while William approached the table where a single sealed box sat waiting, marked only with Evelyn Harrington's initials. He hesitated before touching it, his hand hovering for a brief moment, and then carefully lifted the lid, revealing organized folders, handwritten notes, and a small recording device placed deliberately on top. The silence in the room deepened as he set the lid aside, and he reached first for the device, recognizing it immediately as something his wife had once used for personal notes, though he had not seen it in years. With a slow breath, he pressed play, and the room filled with a soft, familiar voice that caused him to close his eyes briefly before opening them again, as if trying to reconcile sound with memory. Evelyn's voice did not begin with explanation or apology, but with observation, speaking about time and how it changes the way people see each other even when they believe nothing has changed. She spoke about distance not as separation but as accumulation of unspoken moments, and William found himself standing completely still, listening without interruption as though any movement might break the fragile continuity of what he was hearing. Grace watched him from the doorway, her expression unchanged, as the recording continued, describing places she had gone not to escape, but to understand what could not be seen from within familiar walls. Evelyn's voice mentioned children she had met, conversations that revealed more about resilience than circumstance, and how one particular child had reminded her that truth often arrives in forms that are easy to overlook. William slowly lowered himself into the chair near the table without realizing it, the recording continuing as Evelyn described how she had chosen to remain present in these spaces without announcing herself, because presence that is announced often becomes performance rather than understanding. She explained that she had not been hiding, but observing, not withdrawing from life, but expanding into parts of it that did not require recognition. As the recording progressed, William's expression shifted subtly, not with sudden emotion, but with gradual realization that what he had interpreted as absence had in fact been a parallel existence he had never taken part in. Evelyn's voice paused briefly in the recording, then continued with a quieter tone, speaking directly about him without naming him often, describing a person who built structure around certainty but struggled with uncertainty that carried emotional weight rather than measurable outcomes. William's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table as he listened, not in resistance, but in recognition of patterns he could no longer deny. The recording ended with a simple instruction, not of action, but of awareness, asking that if he ever reached this point he should understand that love had not disappeared, but had simply moved into places where it could exist without expectation. The device fell silent, leaving the room filled only with the faint ambient sound of the shelter beyond the door, and William remained seated for several seconds without speaking, absorbing what had just passed through him in a way that felt irreversible. Grace finally stepped forward slightly, not to interrupt, but to place a small folded note on the table beside the box, saying quietly that Evelyn had asked her to leave it there if William ever heard the recording in full. William looked at the note, but did not open it immediately, instead staring at the closed box, the recording device, and the surrounding files as if seeing layers of a life he had never entered. For the first time since arriving at the cemetery, then the shelter, and now this room, William Harrington understood that the truth he had been searching for was not contained in a single revelation, but in the accumulation of moments he had not been present to witness, and that what lay ahead of him now was not explanation, but responsibility to see what had always been there. The silence that followed the recording felt different from every silence William Harrington had experienced before, because it was no longer empty, but filled with the presence of something that had already been said and could not be taken back, only understood in a deeper way than he had ever allowed himself to listen. He remained seated in the small storage room of the shelter, the access card still resting on the table beside the open box, his hands no longer moving, as if even the smallest gesture might interrupt the fragile clarity forming inside him. Grace Williams stood near the doorway, watching without urgency, her small figure steady against the soft light, as though she had fulfilled her role not by delivering answers, but by ensuring he reached the place where answers could no longer be avoided. William finally reached forward and picked up the folded note that Evelyn had instructed be placed beside the recordings, his fingers slow and deliberate, and for a moment he simply held it without opening it, as if acknowledging that whatever remained inside was not a continuation of explanation but the final layer of understanding she had prepared for him. When he opened it, the handwriting was unmistakable, familiar in a way that did not belong to ink alone but to memory, and as his eyes moved across the page, he realized immediately that it was not written to persuade him of anything, but to place responsibility gently into his hands without demanding anything in return. The words spoke of awareness, not correction, describing how she had come to understand that love is not always measured by proximity or visibility, but by the willingness to recognize a person even after distance has rewritten the surface of a shared life. William lowered the note slightly as he read, his breathing slow, his expression no longer controlled in the way it had been at the cemetery, because here there was no audience, no structure to maintain, only the quiet confrontation between what he had assumed and what had quietly existed beyond his perception. Grace stepped forward a little, not intruding but no longer remaining at the threshold, and she asked softly if he understood now why Evelyn had asked her to bring the ring only when he would be ready to see it, not earlier, not later, but at the moment when certainty could no longer shield him from awareness. William did not answer immediately, because the question itself no longer felt like something that required immediate resolution, and instead he looked at the open box again, at the recording device, at the neatly arranged folders, all of which represented fragments of a life that had continued in parallel to the one he thought he had shared completely. He slowly stood from the chair, moving toward the small table in the center of the room, and as he did, the weight of everything he had learned did not increase but settle, as though it had finally found a place where it could exist without resistance. He turned slightly toward Grace and asked her why she had been chosen for this moment, not in doubt, but in genuine curiosity. And Grace considered his question before answering that Evelyn had said some truth requires someone who has not yet learned to assume what others expect, someone who sees without needing to interpret first. William absorbed those words in silence, realizing that the explanation did not diminish the significance of what had occurred, but instead clarified its intention. He looked once more at the ring resting on the table, now no longer an object of mystery, but of connection, and he understood that it had never been meant to prove anything in isolation, but to guide him toward a broader understanding of presence and absence. The shelter around them continued its quiet rhythm beyond the room, distant footsteps and soft voices reminding him that life did not pause for revelation, but continued alongside it, indifferent to the exact moment when understanding finally arrived. William finally folded the note and placed it carefully back into the box, not as closure but as acknowledgement, then closed the lid with a slow, deliberate motion that felt less like ending and more like preserving what had been revealed. He turned toward Grace, and for the first time since arriving at the cemetery, he spoke her name directly, asking if she would walk with him outside, and she nodded without hesitation. As they left the storage room together and moved back through the shelter corridors, William felt the environment around him differently, not as unfamiliar, but as something he had been adjacent to without realizing it for far longer than a single day. When they finally stepped out into the light outside the building, he paused briefly, looking ahead not with confusion, but with a quiet acceptance that the truth he had discovered was not a conclusion, but a beginning shaped by awareness rather than certainty. Grace stood beside him, small but steady, and William Harrington understood without needing words that what Evelyn had left behind was not a mystery to solve, but a life he had never fully seen, and the responsibility now was not to resolve the past, but to finally recognize the reality that had always been there.